Anyway, it's spinning. What's up, wrestling fan? And welcome to the Two Bros Wrestling Show. I'm Doug.
And I'm Kevin.
That's Kevin. Hey, what is happening, everybody? I've got better lighting tonight, I think. I'm struggling with the lighting in the new area, so I hope this works out okay. And
You,
I
you
hope
look
my Wi-Fi looks to be stable for now, so it's a challenge right now. Eventually, we'll be in a nice new studio on this end. Storyteller Studios East will shift slightly to the Southeast Hills, but until then, I'm working in a very small area. What's happening, Kevin? Nobody needed to know that. Nobody cares.
hey, you talk about what you know, and I know that things have been busy. Things have been in the world of
You know
wrestling.
that
They've
I
been
don't know
busy.
that much.
I'm not insinuating that one of the bros is behind, because tonight, Doug, our main event topic is something that requires your history of wrestling, which you don't lose just because you had a busy week. Because we're going to talk about the art of professional wrestling announcing, particularly with all the shuffling we've seen at the broadcast desk. We knew it would be a good time to look about what it is that makes an effective wrestling announcer, what we think about the current crop, as well as I'm going to put you on the spot, ask you some questions about the best of all time. So if you're watching at
Excellent.
home, be thinking of that stuff too, and chime in on the conversation. Let us know what you think. But Doug, before we get to any of that,
Wait. I'm not queued up. Okay, I'm ready. Boom.
I had an opening bell sound effect that just did. Oh, yeah.
Come on.
There we
Okay,
go.
I'm the one that's not ready for this.
What the heck? And now everything's going off. Opening bell time, folks. We're going to
Okay,
start.
copyright strike. What was that?
That's the ad that comes after the opening bell sound effect.
Oh, okay.
But opening bell time, Doug. Trash bag gate, I guess, is what we're going to
Man,
call this.
again, like with every week recently, I haven't watched a lot of wrestling, but I do try and keep up, through like little snippets here and there. So it sounds like, what is it, Carano, Mike, Billy Bob Carano, whatever his name is. Well, not a good guy. Not a good
Well,
guy at all, Kevin.
for those who maybe don't know what this is related to, this goes back to a story we talked about last week about the recent layoffs at WWE amongst the talent. That got a large number of superstars, including Samoa Joe and Peyton Royce, Billy Kay, but one in particular that sort of started a little bit more of fuss this week is Mickie James, the legendary Mickie James, who took to her Instagram on Thursday showing the care package that had arrived at her home of her stuff following her layoff. And Doug, as I kind of alluded to by calling it Trash Bag Gate, they put their stuff in trash bags, piece of tape with their name on it, stuff it in a box, and that is how you get your stuff back to you after you're let go by WWE.
What an awesome
And
severance.
yeah, and it's it'd be bad enough if they did that to a particular person that they were signaling out. But apparently, based on the amount of support Mickie got online from like Maria Kanellis, Gail Kim, ladies who had been, their various release dates were everything from earlier or from last year with Maria to up to 10 years ago with Gail Kim. And they both kind of confirmed that, yeah, that's how I got mine too. So this has been going on apparently a while. And when Mickie made it public, obviously, when things are public now in the age of social media, it does not take long. You get a corporate response back. Triple H, Stephanie, to their credit, said all the right things, apologized profusely, and said that the person responsible was fired. And Doug, as you mentioned, Mark Carano, who is the head, who was
Was.
talent relations, was.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's obviously the buck stops with somebody. Mark is maybe known to folks now. He's been a long-serving behind the scenes. I mean, he's been with WWE a very long time, behind the scenes guy. But fans most recently, though, got a chance to see behind the scenes with all the reality series WWE's involved in. So Mark Carano was a regular character actually on Total Bellas, Total Divas, that you'd see pop up quite a bit actually. And so the fact he's gone is more an indication that it was his store that wasn't being minded, not necessarily that he's the one that made the fateful decision to handle release talent in such a disrespectful way. It should be noted that a lot of other folks in that talent relations department got let go as well. It was quite a shakeup. John Laurinaitis, who is over talent relations, only recently got that position, was not among those that was affected, at least to this point, by this little mini scandal. But Doug, we got to treat our talent a little more respectfully than the crap given to them in a trash bag, right?
At least they boxed it up, At least they boxed the trash bag up before they mailed it instead of just taping it up with their name on the outside and just sending it off. So
yeah, it was pretty awful when you saw the video presentation of how it was done. It definitely looked.
yeah.
I think it's also interesting that none of the male talents have mentioned anything about receiving their stuff.
I really hadn't thought about that, but yeah, everybody that's like you, Maria Kanellis, Lillian Garcia, Gail Kim, hadn't seen that one, but Gail Kim, everybody speaking up has been female about the way they've been treated with
which
their,
is that's an even worse look if there's a sexist element to just the basic disrespect of people being treated that way. But we may have a follow-up on this, Doug, because this could continue to evolve, as apparently it's been going on a while. There may be a lot more folks come forward and we find out more about this practice and maybe who was really responsible for handling things this way.
So as a side note about Carano, I did see earlier today on one of the wrestling vlogs on YouTube, I guess his ex-girlfriend, so take this with a grain of salt, but the ex-girlfriend has been tweeting to Triple H and Stephanie that he hides stolen wrestling belts underneath his bed.
What?
So I don't know how legitimate that is, but I was like, well, that's it. That's interesting.
Well, that would be very interesting, and who knows? Maybe he'll get his chance to tell his side of the story. But we will definitely keep fans apprised as this is a continually evolving situation in the world of professional wrestling. Moving along to financial news, which we don't actually do very much on the show, but the latest figures have been out for the financial results in the first quarter for WWE, and that's the first of the year through March 31st. They reported net income of $43.8 million, which is more double analyst expectations, which estimated their net income to be more along the lines of like $18 million. So they beat their expectations by about $26 million, which is, for those watching, this is absolutely the Peacock deal paying dividends in this first quarter. They were, because of the pandemic, this quarter's analyst predictions was going to be less than it was this time last year anyway. And then they go out and they get 26 million above their expectations. And that is because we can't watch things on our Fire Sticks. That's why they got so much money.
Right.
The latest figures, according to records from the Tampa Bay Sports Authority, show that the total ticket sales for WrestleMania were 40,806 individual ticket sales, and that breaks down as being 20,172 for night one and 20,634 individual ticket sales for night two. This comes into a live gate of 6.2 million for the two-day event, and that's based off of 3 million for Saturday and 3.1 million for Sunday. WWE, for what it's worth, had announced sold-out crowds for both nights with 25,675 people both nights, but those numbers don't add up. It's not unusual for WWE or any wrestling organization, really, throughout history. If you really believe there was 90,000 people in the Silver Dome back for WrestleMania 3, then I have a bridge to sell you. But they're in the ballpark. But we call a 6'5" guy 7 feet tall or something. I mean, it's what wrestling does.
7-footer.
Yeah, exactly. When discussing the fallout of WrestleMania 37 and WWE making changes to this presentation to get those 25,000 people in, Jim Ross on his podcast revealed that AEW is tweaking its schedule in hopes of getting back on the road pretty aggressively beginning in July. So this news it was quickly followed by WWE executives saying that they expect to be touring again in the second quarter of this year. This came out during that conference call that I mentioned earlier on financial results. And as part of this, it is believed that the next live event for WWE is expected to be SummerSlam, where they'll have fans in attendance. Major League Wrestling also announced this week that they're taking a hiatus to, give their talent a chance to recharge in their season. They actually have a little bit of an off season where they go into reruns. And then when they come back in July, they say they will be doing so in front of fans at the ECW arena. So between the independents here and the two big boys, you're seeing now that as we continue to get more vaccinated as a country, that folks are planning to get back on the road to best that they can. MLW and ROH, for example, I know have COVID consultants on staff for all their events to make sure that all the procedures for whatever state they happen to be in, since it goes, obviously state by state and even municipality by municipality, sometimes the rules are different, but you basically have a compliance officer. I can't imagine if ROH and MLW both do that. Surely AEW and WWE, for all the money that they have, before they both go back on the road, surely they would be smart enough to do the same. It's the right thing to do. If you're actually going to go out there and do it, you need to take every precaution you possibly can to keep everyone safe.
Absolutely.
While on the topic of Major League Wrestling, Doug, I know you didn't get to watch a whole lot of wrestling this week. Well, there's about to be a whole lot more for you to miss because MLW announced a new broadcast TV deal this week with Vice TV. The cable organization that does Dark Side of the Ring is going to be bringing the promotion to the network in May. At first, they're going to be presenting archived material because it's going to hit during their off season, but it's going to get folks familiar with the product, the wrestlers. So folks out there, if you're not familiar with or haven't, or missed like Leo Rush and Low Key and Simon Gotch and all these guys are in MLW, and you may not have had a chance to see younger talent like the new Von Erichs, the sons of Kevin Von Erich are out there, Contra Unit with Jacob Fatu and the Filthy Army with Tom Lawler. I mean, there's just some really great talent in MLW. So we're about to actually have another nationally broadcast wrestling show as Vice reaches a good portion of households out there. According to reports, though, this deal that MLW took apparently is one that was originally on the table for New Japan Pro Wrestling back when they were looking for a U.S. TV deal. They were offered this TV deal very similar to this one, and they weren't able to come to terms. They ultimately ended up going, they turned it down, and they ultimately ended up going to Roku as their streaming partner. So the Roku channel does New Japan, which I do watch, Doug, but just for your information, so you don't get this FOMO feeling of yet another one that you're missing out on. The New Japan shows are all 7 or 8 months ago, so they're showing things from the tournaments or the big shows. Basically, they take their pay-per-views.
Big Show on New Japan. What?
He's in New Japan now. He's 9 feet tall. No. And there was 100,000 people, and they were hanging off the rafters. There's a lot of wrestling to watch, is what we're saying. In addition to the
more wrestling for me to miss, and me to go miss. Awesome.
Speaking of one of the smaller promotions, moving on, Ring of Honor announced this week that they are going to be returning their women's division, and they're going to be doing so on their YouTube channel. Each Wednesday, Women's Wednesday, they'll have a new women's match premiere on ROH's YouTube, and it's going to feature both veterans of ROH women's division in the past, as well as newcomers, and that begins this Wednesday, Doug. So be sure to put it on your calendar and not miss.
Right. Oh, gotcha.
Hey,
NWA Power is back now too, isn't it?
NWA Power is back, but it's on Fight TV and it's subscription only, so it's not on their YouTube like it used to be.
Okay, it's in my periphery that I saw something pop up about NWA Power being back, but I wasn't quite sure what the deal was there. So even more wrestling for me not to see now.
Velvet Sky is now a member of the announced team, and so I mean, I've heard good reviews. I myself also have yet to see the return of Power, but there's a lot of wrestling out there.
Speaking of beautiful people, if you get a chance, and if anybody out there in YouTube land has a chance, Google Lacey Von Erich at, I believe it's WrestleCon, and that's it's a three-parter. I didn't watch all three parts. I just caught some highlights of each, but that's real interesting. It's very interesting. Lacey Von Erich at WrestleCon this year.
I'll have to check that out. Doug, I have one last piece of news before our main event. You're talking women's talent. I just want to say, on behalf of the Two Bros Wrestling Show, congratulations to Ronda Rousey and her husband. I know that Ronda had retired from WWE, at least temporarily stepped away after last year's WrestleMania in order to have a family. And I know before this year's WrestleMania, there was a lot of rumors as to, is she popping up, or back during Royal Rumble, is she going to be a mystery entrant? It looks like that she's finally getting motherhood, which is what she wanted all along. So I don't doubt that we'll eventually see her back in the WWE ring. I really think that that's probably her career path moving forward, but it's probably going to be a while. So congratulations to the happy couple.
Absolutely. I wonder how far along she is and how long WWE's actually known, and if they've kept it under wraps until after WrestleMania season to get on the other side of WrestleMania to keep that speculation alive of will she, won't she show up.
September, I believe, is the due date.
Okay.
So, yeah, they yeah. We'll just say, I don't know. What is
Rumble time.
Yeah. 3 or 4 years, right? Is that what a pregnancy is? I don't know. I don't have kids. You tell me. You're the one.
78 days, I think.
And Doug, that is the opening bell.
Excellent. Let's get to this main event.
So we'll set the stage for the main event here. If you've not been watching wrestling here lately, or haven't tuned in the last couple of weeks, you may have missed this because it was very sudden that Adnan Virk, who was an analyst at one point in time with ESPN before he got fired for leaking to the press insider information, and the organization let him go. He most recently worked with Major League Baseball, MLB Network, and he's gone from that sports world into the world of sports entertainment when Tom Phillips was demoted all the way from head of Raw, which, let's face it, regardless of where our alliances, fall amongst all the different wrestling organizations, Raw is the signature show. Monday nights is the pinnacle of wrestling broadcast, and that desk is the desk of Jim Ross. I mean, that's where the Attitude Era was laid. That's where, really everything we've come to love about what wrestling is now. That's the flagship show. So if you're in wrestling broadcasting, that's the seat you want. And very quickly, around the time of WrestleMania, Tom Phillips disappeared and did not participate in WrestleMania at all. And Samoa Joe was let go right after WrestleMania. So instantly you have 2 new color commentators being shifted around. Corey Graves coming back from SmackDown to join a man who's never called professional wrestling before. And it's been rough sledding, just to be quite honest. The man referred to Shane, Drew McIntyre by Sheamus's nickname, and he's calling front face locks headlocks, and he's just in general learning on the job, which there's a whole lot of programming, as we got mentioned at the joke with Doug at the top of the hour. All there is to miss, between main event and superstars and 205 live, and there's plenty of softer landing spots that you could have this guy learn professional wrestling before you put him on Monday nights. But Doug, this is kind of the way that things have gone. I read most recently JR's book, that Under the Black Hat, and it was about his ending tenure in WWE. And it was really eye-opening to read this about just how often you'd show up on a show day and Vince McMahon tell you, "We're going in a different direction, pal." And somebody else was sitting on the desk that night on live TV days. Like, it seems like there's been a history of Vince, especially, making these decisions rather knee-jerk.
Yeah, it seems like, that's just historically speaking, and even up to today. Every Tuesday in any Raw review you're going to see, you're going to hear about how the show was completely rewritten hours, if not minutes, before it went on air. and it just seems to be the way McMahon runs things. It goes back to what we were talking about before, that audience of one. You don't have to impress anybody out there in TV land. You just have to impress one person or get over with that one guy. And I guess it's that way for the announce team too. So,
I mean, my background is in, my degree was in journalism. I have a lot of friends that are in journalism. I understand if you're working a news desk that things are breaking news. Things happen on the fly. You have a format that you follow, but sometimes that has to be shuffled around right before the show because things are constantly happening. I can't speak for the world of entertainment, but I would think that for almost any other type of entertainment that is not a news broadcast, that there really shouldn't be the every single week we're tearing up everything and writing it again hours beforehand. And there certainly would not be a need when you have a Tom Phillips who's, done an adequate job, I suppose. Let him go a couple more Monday nights and then move him and give some time for Adnan to actually learn before you put him out there to be crucified. And even JR himself came out this week to say, hey, I've met the guy a time or two. He seems like a good guy. He's a good announcer. Let's give him time. Basically telling the fans that, give him a bit of a break. But it's not really Verk's fault that he doesn't know the product. I mean, if Vince called right now in the middle of our show, Doug, I got to say, I'm probably not going to be here next week. I'll probably be on Raw tomorrow night. Doesn't mean I want to do a good job or that would be doing, that wouldn't be adequate preparation. But I understand why the man would take the position. So it's not completely his fault that he was just thrown into the deep waters and is learning on the job, which is not what any of us would be asked to do in any other line of work. But in wrestling, you are, at least by Vince McMahon.
It's a very different world. Let me say, for a scripted program, because I have worked in live TV, and you're absolutely right. Other than breaking news, things are rarely rewritten, or shuffled around. Everything is timed down to the minute, down to the second to hit commercial breaks and everything. Even in a news program, even in like a 6 or 11 o'clock news broadcast, you're working down to the second to throw to commercials, throw to correspondence in the field. In a scripted program, there's really no reason to have things changed up to the last minute. Unless somebody gets injured in the ring or something, then you've got to call an audible in the ring. Sure, I get that. Something breaks backstage, you have to throw in another direction. But those are things that are happening in the moment. Just in like the moment, not scripted to happen for like weeks. I mean, they have an entire week to write this show. It seems to me that it constantly gets rewritten hours before it goes live.
Just like you said, that with your experience in broadcasting, the reason that you have all those things timed down is because if you didn't, it'd be chaos.
Yes.
But it almost seems that Vince McMahon thrives in that environment of chaos. And that's something that really came through to me in JR's book too, is that the boss man there and not the big boss man, but rest in peace, Ray Traylor. But Vince himself is 24 hours a day living and breathing this business, which is part of what's made him the man that he is, but also part of what drives other people crazy trying to figure out what the chairman wants this week. JR in his book basically made it sound like when what he heard it anyway was, when we want to go a different direction, we want a new face. It was, we don't want your face with the paralysis that you've suffered with Bell's palsy to be the face of our broadcast before. And there's no doubt about it that, Vince has a history of cosmetically favoring certain looks. And Vince also, Doug, has a history of wanting that legitimacy of someone from the outside coming in and expect them to just pick up the world of pro wrestling. It kind of brings to mind to me, you remember Mike Adamle?
Yes, that's I was going to bring him up. Man, that poor guy had no chance.
No chance.
He's alive.
And it was very quickly after he was at that desk, I would think maybe 2-3 weeks of just awful presentation on his part, that they started to turn it into a joke, and then they turned his character into a joke and quickly went back, and JR was brought back to the announce desk, which again was a common theme in JR's book, is we go a different direction, and then it didn't work out, and then here I come like a fool every time he offered me that job, because again, it's the prime job that every sportscaster in wrestling wants. JR would take it back, and Adam Lee, unfortunately, coming from the real sports world, turns out he had CTE issues that they didn't realize at the time. So part of that was maybe why he was so poorly spoken on the microphone. But it began after the first week. There was almost a watch going on. It's like, how much longer until they pull him from the desk? Verk is not nearly as bad as Adam Lee was, but it wouldn't surprise me if what we're watching right now is an experiment and that the clock is ticking as to, is it Tom Phillips? Who is it that gets called in to pick this up when Verk is not able to just learn on the job? Because Doug, maybe a little history is required here. For those of us who've only, if you're watching wrestling and you haven't been a fan for 30, 40 years, it's just pretty generally accepted that the presentation of wrestling is just that. This is a presentation of an entertainment event. But the roots of the sport were, whether it's hard to believe for us these days or not, is that people thought it was real and they did everything they could to mimic it.
What do you mean thought it was real?
Sorry, Doug, to let you know. But I mean, that's where the role of wrestling broadcaster came from, is that all the major sports had a broadcaster. So we would have a broadcaster along with a color commentator to, again, mimic what a sports broadcast would look like. And that's how you end up with 2-3 person announce desk now. And each of those roles, though, is a lot more than just like it is for baseball, football. Those folks, as trained as they are, as good as Verk is at calling Major League Baseball, he knows that sport and he calls what he sees. That isn't what you do in professional wrestling. Sometimes what you see is something you better not mention, or sometimes the things you call are things that didn't actually happen, but you're trying to get the person home to think that they did. It's a work. Sorry, Doug, it's a work.
But the announce team, whether it's a 2-man, 3-man, or even some of these expanded announce teams you have when you have wrestlers coming down and working with the announce team, you're trying to get over the storyline, you're trying to get over the action in the ring, and you are really a participant and a player, a major player in what's going on in the ring, because like you say, you are selling exactly like the folks in the ring are selling. When that obvious is not even a near miss happens, somebody's going to call it out, but not like you said, call it out, and say, oh my God, that was a terrible miss. But, the old go-to is, I don't believe he fully connected with that one, but he got a little bit of it,
Or you use some of your JR-isms, that's bowling shoe ugly. Probably means that the match is not really going that great, or these aren't two great workers in the ring. But you don't say that. I mean, a baseball announcer might say, "Man, this is a sloppy game," or "This is a blowout." I mean, you would never say that on wrestling. I mean, it's got to always seem like a competitive match, or that things are going well, even when they're not. And that's one of the areas where real sports broadcasting and wrestling broadcasting start to disconnect. And obviously, it helps to have broadcasting in your background. There's nothing wrong with coming from another sport. And, Jonathan Coachman is a recent example. Charlie Caruso is an example who kind of went both ways as a sports reporter in the WWE world, now on to ESPN. I mean, there's definitely room for crossover. I mentioned the history of wrestling. It's worth noting that if you look at the early wrestling shows, a lot of them were what they call studio wrestling. They took place in the television studios of your local TV station. Oftentimes, Doug, the guys that were doing the broadcasting were the sports announcers for that TV station. Or, Bob Caudle was a weatherman and was, one of my favorite announcers as a kid. So it's not without precedent, and Verk could certainly pick that up. But to your point, it's storytelling. It's getting the emotions across. It's selling. It's selling. That next pay-per-view is always just a few weeks away, and you have to convince the folks at home why they need to have that pay-per-view purchased, why they need to have that subscription now to the whatever platform it's on, however it's done. You're really doing more than just calling what's in the ring.
So, I think it's interesting that you call out Bob Caudle as being one of your favorites when you were a kid, because I don't think I really understood the role of the announcer. As a kid, I was, it was like almost like, oh, those are the old guys that are sitting at the desk, or
Yeah.
I didn't quite get how they were actually enhancing what I was watching at the
No.
time. And maybe they were that good back in the day, or maybe it's because I was 5 and watching wrestling. But
Yeah. It's a little both, a little column A and column B, because all of us were, even if you weren't 5, if you were our age watching back then, we know a whole lot more now than anyone's ever known about the inner workings of professional wrestling. Because back then they really did try to keep some of that stuff as if it were a secret. A lot easier to do when our news came from magazines that were basically just enhancing the storylines. And every month I'd wait for my Pro Wrestling Illustrated or something, and that's how I found out my wrestling news. Now with the internet, we all know everything about booking meetings and who's in, who's out. In some ways it does lose a bit of the mystique, but it also goes to show that what was happening back then, Doug, you didn't think about it, because the way it was presented to you was in a way that no matter your age, you understood it. You were being sold on, that Dusty Rhodes storyline that Gordon Soley was enforcing to you. You just watching, thinking that he's the guy that calls the action, the old guy sitting at the desk.
yes,
But obviously, he's a lot more than that. To me, I liked it best when the main announcer is the voice of the fan. And I think that that's the way that JR's, described it. Like when JR, who does indignation just about better than anybody, when it's by God, he's whatever, you're like mad too, because you're right, JR. He shouldn't be doing that to our hero. And to me, the color guy, again, I know that these lines have been blurred through the years. I still think it works best when your straight man is the voice of the fan calling the action. And then think back to like Gorilla Monsoon, right? Gorilla just called the action down the middle, and Bobby Heenan there, he was the heel. I mean, the guys on the announce desk help you, the fan, figure out what you're supposed to feel if those roles are just as defined as they are in the ring. If there's a good guy and a bad guy in the ring, and the good guy and a bad guy on commentary, it makes things, to me, Doug, I don't know what you think, I think it makes it a whole lot less convoluted. And I think over the last 10 years or so with tweeners, and I think there's been too much of the tweener on the announce desk too, that it makes it hard for me as a fan to know if I should be mad that guy's cheating or not, when you have guys produced 1 week or one match, even match by match, right. Like this time he's really mad that the heels are cheating, and the next time he's praising the face for all the work that he's putting in behind the scenes. Like Bobby Heenan never did that. He always Gorilla would call out, "Did you see that?" And I'm sorry, my monitor just went out on me, or so. I mean, there was always some BS reason why Bobby never saw anything the bad guys did, and it worked.
I think by the time I figured out what was going on, as far as like, oh, okay, these guys are just as much part of the action as the guys in the ring, it was pretty clear that, it works best when you have, your heel and face announcer and your heel and face in the ring together. It works like that. It just really does.
Yeah, Gorilla Bobby, old school JR and King. I mean, it was clear one guy was the voice of the fan, that we were at home feeling just like Gorilla does, just like JR does. It's obvious how we should feel, that wrong is wrong. And King or Bobby, being bad guys themselves, would try to convince us otherwise. Jesse Ventura. I mean, just the classic, when you think of classic folks on the microphone. I thought that Samoa Joe was great in that role, and Corey Graves is great in that role. But there's a lot of graying now that makes it hard sometimes, I think, to get for especially bad guys to get heat. Like if they're in the ring cheating their butts off, and the announcers are too busy talking about like the next pay-per-view or something, and not actually like showing that indignation of like, did you see that? Well, that's the worst thing. Like, how dare he? Or, I mean, JR could get real good, heat going on a bad guy by just being outraged and showing that outrage and conveying that outrage. But sometimes Michael Cole, and this is not slamming Cole, but it's unfortunately just the way a lot of guys are produced now. They're so busy doing the selling that the the getting the heat or getting the babyface reaction through the commentary sometimes gets lost.
Yeah, totally. It totally does.
And
We're
even mentioned before in one of his books too about how they're towards the last couple of years of his WWE run, he was so busy trying to sell whatever or talk about the main event coming up that they were telling him, "Don't call the moves. Stop calling the moves." Which might be maybe the next part of our conversation, Doug, is that there appears to be different attitudes amongst the different companies about how they handle their broadcasters.
What? I can't imagine, having worked in live TV, like in broadcast news, I know there's somebody constantly in your ear, whether it's okay, we're throwing to so and so in the field, or okay, we're about to roll this piece, in 3, 2, 1, and then count down to like the next thing. But everything I've read about the WWE, and I'm sure it's similar in every announce booth, but it's most intense in the WWE, where you have somebody in your ear constantly say this now, promote this, say this, where it's to the point of distraction. So I gotta say, first off, kudos to those guys who can continue talking and processing when you've got a madman yelling in your ear about what you're saying next.
Yeah, that's it too. It's not just say this, say that. It's expletives and yelling from everything that anybody says. I know I've referenced JR's book many times tonight, but when we're talking announcing, it's hard to not talk Jim Ross. But JR was talking about Mick Foley joining him on the announce desk when they were both moved to SmackDown, when SmackDown's was when JR got moved off of Raw and for a brief time got moved to SmackDown. Mick Foley got off the broadcast that first night, and of course Mick Foley had been around. Mick Foley had been through ECW, WCW, been with WWE for a long time. The announcing gig was new to him. Mick, a great talker. That first night he gets off there and basically asked JR, "Is it always like that? I have never had him talk to me that way in my whole life." And here he'd been dealing with McMahon for years. And he was just aghast that that's the way that he was going to be treated. He thought he'd just done that bad of a job, that the boss was that mad at him that night. And JR had to confide in him and basically say, "No, man, that's the gig." I mean, that's the way. And Mick did not last very long in that gig either. As good as he was, I mean, most guys just can't handle being yelled at. You talk about Bob Caudle, you didn't pay any attention to, other than that's the old guy at the desk. I guarantee you no one was yelling in Bob Caudle's ear. I think that that's definitely a more modern, overly produced WWE thing. I think most like the wrestlers back in those days who were allowed to speak for themselves and not be scripted. I don't think the announcers were nearly as tightly scripted as they are today, especially in WWE.
Yeah, I thought I watch a lot of AEW. But I can't, with a seasoned announce team where you have Tony Schiavone, JR, and Excalibur. I see them getting a lot more free reign. There might be the typical production things that are going through the headset. I can see going on in like the AEW production and ROH production. MLW Impact. I can see a much more typical production style happening there. We're going to throw to this package. This is coming up. Don't forget to promo this coming up, but not constantly. Don't say this, don't say that. Call it this, call it that. Sell those Snickers bars or whatever.
There's certain things too that are just so like cringeworthy that you'll hear on a WWE broadcast that you can almost hear it in the old man's voice. I mean, I hate to say it. There's just certain lines that would even come out of JR's mouth back in the day when like, no, that isn't JR. That's Vince McMahon yelling at JR, like, say blah, 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 because it'll, it would either be something that was appealing to Vince's sophomoric humor or just, it was something that just wasn't natural for a lot of these announcers to say. You're not stuck. I can hear you.
Okay, there we go. You were stuck. Okay, Wi-Fi issues. It's the house.
That's all right. You got a little bit stuck on me there, but I heard you the whole time.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think that it is important to note that when we talk about WWE main event style, that's kind of a shorthand for a certain way of working a wrestling match that maybe is different in other companies. I think that the announcing is different in other companies. Ring of Honor, MLW, they definitely treat it like a straight up sport. They are more inclined, I think, to do the old school style of broadcasting where you're just calling what you're seeing, you're calling the moves very specifically, and you're treating it like a sport. WWE obviously less concerned and focused on the sport than they are the storytelling. You know, JR, again, he was produced to say, call them the moves less. We stopped mentioning the names of the referees, like they're just the referee. Don't make it, you know, don't get into the details. ROH, MLW getting the details. WWE more focused on the storytelling. AEW seems to be sort of somewhere in between. They don't call it like straight up sport. They have more of those entertainment elements to it, but not to the extent of WWE. Would you think that's probably a fair assumption in the way that you hear it too?
Yeah, I think definitely so. I really like with the 3-man team on Dynamite. I know I'm the mark, but yeah, I really love the flavor that Excalibur brings to, you know, this season announced team with Shivani and JR, because Excalibur is just not yelling at, you know, move after move after move after move, calling them, you know, and I mean, and then you've got JR, the man, the legend, JR, and Shivani in his own right, a legendary wrestling announcer as well. But
I wonder what JR thinks overall, because I know that when it first went from he and King to a 3-man booth on Raw, he thought that that was too much traffic. He liked the 2-man booth. I personally would probably lean towards having a 2-man booth. Again, I want that clear face. I want that clear heel. I want a guy calling the action and then the guy telling the story. I think sometimes it gets a little harder in a 3-man booth for everyone to stand out. I've noticed thus far with like Verk on Monday nights is that even though he's the play-by-play guy, he is probably speaking at this point less than his two color commentators, because I think that they're carrying him right now. I agree with you 100% though. Excalibur has that old school I'm calling the moves, and JR used to be more like that, but I think that, you know, with today's modern wrestling, JR probably doesn't know a lot of the modern moves, especially the high-flying stuff, the way that Excalibur is like an encyclopedia of that stuff. And you know, I will credit too where it's due. Impact recently had some announced changes, and Matt Striker is their play-by-play guy now. Regardless of how anyone out there feels about Matt Striker, he has that very similar Excalibur Ian Riccaboni thing where he's such a big fan. He knows the move so well that he's definitely calling it like a sport. And D'Lo is his commentator, his color commentator there. And I think they do a really good sports-like presentation. Doug, of the modern day announced desk, who do you think is probably your favorite currently? Who's doing it the best?
Man, I have to go with the 3-man. Shocker here, but I have to go with that 3-man team. Even though on Dynamite, even though there's not really a clearly defined, if there is, I'm not noticing it, which is probably bad. But I don't see a clearly defined heel face division there. There, you've got two seasoned veterans, you know, calling it and basically advocating for the audience, like you were talking about. But Excalibur's not, you know, running the heel, or, you know, Excalibur's calling the match. You know, and you've got Shivani and JR. It's very unusual for, you know, and maybe that's why I like that, because I do have to agree with you that I would much rather prefer like the old school, you know, face heel dynamic in the announce booth too. But there's something refreshing about, you know, everybody's a face on that team, other than announce team, unless you have a heel come over, like when Taz comes over, or, you know, somebody else comes in, and then you've got that heel working. But then it's a 4-man booth. Then at that point, it's getting a little crowded.
Yeah. I have nothing but respect for Tony, and I think the relationship he has with JR really shows on camera that they've just known each other for decades, and I like that. I wouldn't be opposed though if Tony maybe got this new show that AEW keeps promising is coming and open that spot up and slot Taz in there. Taz is amazing, and then you'd have JR with his righteous indignation, Taz, who does nothing but you know, praise the heels and talk, you know, the good evil talk so well, and Excalibur, the straight man right in the middle, calling all the moves that these guys. That would be ideal to me. I think it's interesting. And from my perspective now that they have the new team on SmackDown, I'm not a Michael Cole fan. I think maybe sometimes He gets a lot of criticism because he's not JR, and that didn't help his case any, that fans love JR so much and saw him as the anti-JR. He does fine, but I think that Pat McAfee has a really good chance with the two of them, because McAfee is pure heel. There's no doubt about it. I think as he improves in his new position as the color commentator on SmackDown, I think that could be the sneaky little team to watch. The underappreciated, maybe Michael Cole, just playing it straight with the corporate line of like, just I'm calling the matches, I'm selling the pay-per-views, and then McAfee with his constant heel mannerisms there. That could be as close as there is right now to the heel face dynamic I see out there.
Absolutely. But yeah, let's not sell Cole short, because we have to give him props for carrying on a show. We're talking about, breaking news, things happening that you just can't help live. Michael Cole carried on an episode of Raw while his commentator, his broadcast partner, basically died next to him.
True, absolutely true. I do think that, and again, once again, referencing JR's book, but JR even said that, behind the scenes, Cole's a nice guy, a hard worker, a seasoned war broadcaster, again, showing that you can have a broadcasting background. It definitely helps. And then you can pick up the sport of wrestling. That man was a pro to just do exactly what you said, go on in such tough circumstances, maybe a little underappreciated. And JR said in his book that he thinks the fans rejected him because you replaced JR and we love JR. And that wasn't anything to do with Michael Cole. To me, Ian Riccaboni, I'm going to call out Ian Riccaboni on Ring of Honor, I think is currently maybe my favorite. If I had to pick a favorite play-by-play broadcaster, he reminds me of the old school Jim Ross. And that's nothing against the modern version of JR, but I'm a big wrestling fan. I know my wrestling, but I'm not like smug about how I know my wrestling. I'm just literally passionate about this. He calls it like a sport. He calls the holds. Caprice Coleman's his play-by-play guy who doesn't play the role of the heel necessarily, but Ian Riccaboni definitely has that youthful enthusiasm as well as product knowledge. I mentioned Matt Striker earlier and all his product knowledge. Striker can, because he's kind of naturally a heel, there's a smugness to Striker where his smartness with the stuff he knows almost sounds like I'm bragging that I know the stuff that you don't know. Whereas Ian Riccaboni's just feels like pure, just joy of like loving of the business. So I'm really a fan of Ian Riccaboni's work these days, but not all time. Let's talk all time, Doug. All time. We've had between the two of us here, we've been watching for 30 some years, the 40 years, I guess. That's a lot of broadcasters we've seen come and go. I'm going to put you on the spot. Give me your top three all time.
Top three all time. Okay. Broadcast team, JR and King. Absolutely. Mauro Ronaldo, his time in NXT, Mauro, great, and swinging back around to Excalibur, I think Excalibur is great for what he does. There was a time back in the Monday Night Wars when I could not stand Schiavone. I just, I did not like Tony Schiavone, but maybe it's because he works for Tony Khan, man. Tony Khan sends me a check every week.
You and I had the conversation, Doug, though, not long ago. I think it's worth sharing with the people watching, is that we almost had forgotten how good Tony could be.
Yes.
When we started wrestling, I mean, Tony would have been around, not very long after we started watching World Championship Wrestling and things. Mm-hmm. And I liked him then. It's just, to your point, the product was so bad there at the end of WCW, and then he was opposite JR, who was beloved, that it was easy to pit them against each other and then to blame him for a bad product that by the end it was quite obvious that he also had no passion for calling because he knew what he was watching was crap. He's been a refreshing surprise to me, actually. Just as a reminder of like, oh, yeah, I like this, Tony. So for me, if I had to do it, Bob Caudle, who we mentioned earlier, sentimentally, I'd like to say because he was the voice of Mid-Atlantic when I was a kid. But if I had to be honest, I'd probably slot into that third position for me, Lance Russell, who called Memphis Wrestling, who was an incredible announcer and had come from the sports world. It was the sports announcer at the TV station, but was a great commentator. JR, definitely one of the best to ever do it. not just the modern version, but it's particularly the man from the 90s and early 2000s was just, it's hard to say that there was any better. I'm torn here, but to say that he was the best of all time. But if I had to say, and this might be some sentimentality here, Gordon Solie. Gordon was considered at the time to be the Howard Cosell of professional wrestling. There was just a legitimacy to Gordon Solie. He seemed to me, even at the time as a kid, I could tell he was a little bit different than the other announcers. He had that classic broadcaster voice. There was a unique voice that he had. That if you heard him on the call, you could picture this guy doing, football on the radio or something. Like he was telling a story. And unlike today's modern announcers who do it as a team, for the most part, most of his career, Gordon Solie was calling these things completely by himself. Just the one man out there calling the action and telling the story to the fans and selling you on what it is that you should be. I know that JR would probably say that Gordon was the best of all time, even though a lot of folks would say, no, JR, it's you. Yeah, I put those two as 1 and 2 for me, for certain.
Cool.
And Doug, that is announcing. That is where we currently are in the world of professional wrestling, where we have unfortunately, this history of announcing and the art of announcing isn't maybe appreciated at the highest levels, where we're now to the point where we think that just anybody can do it. Let's just put them out there and see if they sink or swim.
That does seem to be the Vince McMahon way of thinking. But that has been announcing. You ready for the big finish?
Let's go to the big finish, Doug. I want to start with my botch of the week. If you're watching this live, fans, and I appreciate you for doing so, because if you're watching it live, you're missing Impact Retribution in order to do so. And I know I have called this out before. It was my botch of the week last week, and I have mentioned it several times before that I've been just very upset with the way that there's been no equity in this Impact AEW relationship. And because those titles are going to be unified in a main event that's going to start here probably in another hour and a half, I thought this would be my last chance to call it out, because some new information came out this week. Not only did AEW not promote the fact that their world champion was at risk of losing his belt in a unification match, it took Don Callis to mention it on the microphone, and it only happened once, but the Wrestling Observer reported that those commercials that you saw this week on Dynamite advertising the Retribution pay-per-view were actually paid for by Impact Wrestling. Impact actually had to pay to let AEW fans know that the AEW champion was defending his belt against their world champion at this weekend's pay-per-view. I don't know what the financial arrangement is. I know that Tony Khan appears on Impact regularly. I know that the Good Brothers, it'd be easy to think that they were AEW talent. They're on every single week, and certainly their absence would make the whole storyline, the whole Elite getting together storyline, so much weaker if they weren't there. So I don't understand why in the world Impact Wrestling would have to use their own money to buy time on AEW to sell what should be something that AEW is helping to promote. So that's just, again, I'm sure one day all of the details will come out, and I look forward to hearing what these are, because I can't imagine why it wasn't more favorable for Impact, financially speaking, that you couldn't take the time to make it seem like this weekend's match was as big a deal as what it should be.
Right. Yeah, I have to agree with that totally. I mean, to hear that they had to pay for that, because Don Callis, you could also be, you'd be forgiven thinking Don Callis is, an AEW talent as well, just the same as the Good Brothers, and you really would not know that Rich Swann is in danger of losing something this tonight.
If Rich Swann's name's been mentioned on AEW Dynamite, I've just been face down on my phone for a second or something, because I don't think I've ever heard it even mentioned on AEW Dynamite. So that's my botch of the week. Doug, my performer of the week. I know you didn't catch Raw this past week, but I'm going to give my performance of the week to something that will happen on Raw. Drew and Braun, you're my performers of the week. Thank you for taking those stupid masks off T-Bar and Mace. So you demasked them, which I think was symbolic of, like, now they don't have to wear these stupid masks. Now, if you could only also strip away those dumb names so that they can go back to being Dominic Dijakovic and Dio Madden, that would be great too. But so far, so good.
And if we could also get Mia Yim back to being Mia Yim, that would be excellent as well.
They did move her to SmackDown, by the way. So they definitely split up that Retribution group.
I've never cared for Retribution. Early on had potential, but as soon as the Anarchists officially signed contracts, it made no sense.
Yeah.
And those guys are talented. And Dio, my goodness, we've seen him live. Dude is huge. Moved the entire ring with a move.
And I like Dijakovic back to his ROH days. So I think actually those two as a big man tag team, I like them together. Yes. But just keep those masks off of them and give them names that don't sound ridiculous.
Yes, please.
Match of the week, Doug. I know you didn't see any wrestling, but I'm going to give you a match of the week that you're going to see because it happened on AEW.
Okay. We're going to try and catch some AEW later tonight, at least get caught up on that.
Second week in a row, I've got to say that the women are definitely outperforming the men in the world of professional wrestling. Obviously the wrestling world is still abuzz over WrestleMania being stolen by Sasha and Bianca. But Dynamite was stole this week, in my opinion, by Hikaru Shida defending her AEW Women's Championship against Ty Conti, who was someone who, for whatever reason, Vince McMahon did not see anything in. They let her walk out of NXT, which is just impossible to believe. But those two had a heck of a performance on AEW Dynamite. So that is my match of the week. Definitely, if you didn't see that, folks, go check that one out. If there's one match you need to see, it's that one.
And I find that surprising too, because Triple H has a good eye for NXT talent. When that talent gets to the main roster, I mean, they go in a completely different direction most of the time. But Triple H seems to have a really good eye, and folks who have the cream rises to the top there in NXT, it seems. But I don't know. I don't know how they let her go. I do not understand that.
The jiu-jitsu background, the exoticness of being from Brazil, and there was so much for them to work with. She had a great look, hard worker. Obviously, she's better now, I think, than she was in NXT that I can remember. Her and Shida had a great match. Really happy to see that the AEW's women division has taken a turn in the direction that it should have been from the start, but better late than never.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad I have some marker points to follow for wrestling to get caught up on later tonight. But Kevin, you got anything else for us, brother?
I will tell everyone that next week we are back at 8:00. If you enjoyed hearing about the history of wrestling announcing, we got another historical perspective to talk about next week, and that is, Doug, from the days of the Four Horsemen of yesteryear to your inner circle of today. We're going to be looking at factions.
Fortune 4.
We're going to be looking at factions because they're back. We're going to go into the history of factions, what makes a great one, what makes a faction in general. How many guys does it take to make a faction? We're going to see it from every different angles and maybe talk a little bit about why is there a resurgence right now, especially in AEW. Right. Not every company treats your factions the same. We're going to talk about why that may be. And if you're an old school NWO, a Four Horsemen fan, DX, talk factions with us. Join us next week.
I love me a good faction war. Until next week, take care, everybody.